Welcome to the second session of our conference. I'm very pleased to be introducing these two scholars, both of whom I know well from one setting or another. But our first speaker is Taylor Coughlin, who holds a BA in Classics from Carleton College in Minnesota, an MA in Classics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and is currently writing a dissertation at the University of Cincinnati on the topic of dialect mixture and poetic meaning in Hellenistic book epigrams. So as this conference will indicate, he's taken on a very large and complicated subject, and I look forward eagerly to the results. Taylor is already a published scholar. He has a paper in BASF, and he has another forthcoming paper in ZPE. He's going to be talking to us today about dialect and imitation in late Hellenistic epigram.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you, Catherine, and I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me. Obviously, this whole conference has great interest to my current research. In this paper, I will present some of the results of my research into the use of dialect as a tool in the production of literary meaning in a Hellenistic book epigram. My focus will be on the role dialect plays in the imitation and variation of earlier epigrammatic models in several later Hellenistic book epigrammaticists, namely Antipater of Sidon and Archias. I argue that these later authors were sensitive readers of dialect choice and used imitation or variation of dialect, like diction, syntax, or theme, to express their interpretations and reception of the model. A thesis, which if accepted, would have implications not only for how we treat the reception of dialect by later Greek readers, but also for the issue of the originality and meaning of dialect mixture. No one, to my knowledge, has examined the art of imitation with an eye to what it can tell us about the dynamics of dialect usage in Hellenistic book epigram. I believe it has a good deal to tell us. Besides being crucial to developing a better understanding of the damage wrought by the textual transmission, imitation can shed an important new light on how dialect was read, interpreted, and reused in a Hellenistic literary environment. In many ways, imitation is a textualized act of reading. The aspect of the model epigram that an imitator chooses to adopt, vary, or discard provides an insight into the poet's reading of his model text, as much as it spurs our own reading. Meleager's practice of placing model and imitation in close proximity in the garland, which likely has its roots in the inscriptional record, fashions a physical context for the reproduction of the imitating poet's act of close reading. When reading closely, did an epigrammaticist register the dialect of his model? In order to begin to answer this question, I turn to epigrams that are recognizable as close imitations of a model poem, where the imitating poet borrows the subject, structure, and point of a model epigram, and principally introduces variation through a change of wording or internal ordering of the thought. Close imitations provide a secure framework to test if the copying or variation of dialect was part of the imitating author's poetic practice, since we know they are focused, to a not insignificant degree, on the textual fabric of their model. Antipater of Sidon is the most prolific of surviving epigrammaticists to engage in this mode of imitation, and so it is on him that I focus my discussion today. I present evidence in what follows that Antipater was a canny reader and interpreter of dialect usage in his 3rd century epigrammatic models. To begin to make this case, one must first accept that dialect had or made meaning in his model texts. In what follows, I focus my discussion on epigrams whose models use dialect in a demonstrably productive manner. Before turning to individual epigrams, a note on my conventions in marking dialect forms. Doric forms will appear in bold, Ionic will be underlined, Hellenistic Koine features that stand in marked contrast with the surrounding dialect will be in italics, and Homeric forms will be italicized and underlined. These are listed on your handout as well. I print dialect forms that reproduce the manuscript sources for the epigrams, accepting modern dialect emendations only in instances where the transmitted forms are grammatically or metrically impossible. I begin with Asclepiades' epitaph for Ajax, which is number 1A on the handout, and whose dialect usage has several layers of interpretive resonance. Virtue, speaking as both the tomb and a mourner, adopts the epigraphic practice of composition in the dialect of the deceased, even in situations of burial abroad. With one exception, the witness transmits a consistent Doric patina based on the substitution of Doric alpha for Attic Ionic eta. Planudes transmits emu for emau, which contains a resolution of the epsilon omicron diphthong prevalent in contemporary Doric, and should be understood as one of the manuscript's many regularizations of a non-Attic Ionic dialect feature. Ajax's homeland of Salamis, before being turned over to Athenian control following his death, was Megarian, and Asclepiades' use of Doric, as Alexander Sens has noted, can be read as an acknowledgement of the Telamonians' imagined native dialect. Besides replicating epigraphic conventions, the use of Doric has further resonances. As scholars have long recognized, Asclepiades was likely inspired to combine virtue and Ajax by Aristotle's hymn to virtue for his father-in-law Hermias, in which the poet uses Achilles and Ajax as a heroic exempla for Hermias' noble sacrifice of his life. The hymn opens with Doric arata, a dialect choice that initiates the light Doric coloring present throughout the rest of the song. Asclepiades also features Doric arata on the first line of his epitaph, and it is quite probable that the similarity in dialect coloring is designed to recall the model. This discussion demonstrates that Asclepiades' choice of Doric dialect was laden with interpretive meaning. Antipater's version of Ajax's epitaph employs similar dialect features. This is number 1B. Again, the predominant Doric feature is the substitution of Doric alpha for Attic Ionic eta, which you find in the repeated use of arata. As is common with Antipater's imitations, the poet expands upon his model and often makes his engagement quite explicit. Reversing the structure of Asclepiades, Antipater relates to the reader in the first line the occupant of the tomb and its location, information that, if we know the model poem, would direct the reader to expect the introduction of virtue in the pentameter. Arata is the first Doric form the reader encounters, and so communicates to him or her the association with the expected intertext, an expectation that the editor of AP makes evident in the juxtaposition of the two poems. While not dialectally marked, Antipater's use of thumobares, a neologism, in place of tlamon, acts as a corrective to the ambiguity of the Homeric term, which can mean both stout-hearted and a wretched, and so makes further evident Antipater's epigram as a reading and interpretation of his model. Antipater adds a further couplet in which virtue imagines the preference of Achilles' armor for the manly courage of Ajax over the wily machinations of Odysseus. Speeches that envision what people might say are a feature of Homer, and Antipater employs some episizing language in taukeia and achilleos that would evoke an imagined Homeric setting. Within the speech itself, we find another epicism, ames, but the pro-Ajax bias of virtue shines through the epic veneer in the Dorici's alkos, which reminds the reader of the critical lens, inspired in part by Aristotle's hymn, through which the reader is invited to view Ajax. The association between place and dialect is a motivating factor in a number of 3rd century inscriptional type epigrams. Next, I treat 2 epigrams by Leonidas, one dedicatory, another ekphrastic, whose use of Doric is designed to recall the oral soundscape of the dedicator's native land and the local context of a piece of art. In a similar fashion to his engagement with Asclepiades' Ajax epitaph, we shall see that Antipater and the later epigrammaticist Archias read and rewrote these epigrams through recourse to dialect, in some instances drawing on their regional associations. I begin with Leonidas' ekphrastic epigram on Apelles' Aphrodite and Diomene, number 2a, which was dedicated, according to Pliny, at the temple of Asclepius at Kos. The epigram has a Doric patina with the admixture of 2 Koine features. After 2 lines that establish the content, Aphrodite's birth from the sea foam, line 3 opens with a command to see, ide, how Apelles compellingly brings the mythic scene to life. While the identity of the speaker is never given, One possibility is that the reader is encouraged to imagine that they are hearing the eyewitness report of Leonidas at Kos. If that is the case, the Doric may well be meant to reflect an artificial version of the poet's native Tarentine dialect. The epigram also borrows its structure from the informative inscriptions appended to works of art, most notably on the basis of statues. Considering the epigraphic antecedents that lay behind the epigram and the painting's display context on Doric-speaking Kos, I suggest we read the Doric of the epigram as reproducing the original context of viewing. Any simple label written for the painting was likely to have been in Doric, and the use of the dialect in the voice of our guide focalizes the painting through a Cohen perspective. Antipater GP45, number 2b, is a condensed version of Leonidas's original, in which he retains the same structure. Antipater reproduces the opening Doric feminine accusative article and participle combination present in Leonidas, except here, in the usual fashion of Antipater, his variation of ek fugusan for the Doric anaduomenon possibly echoes the name by which the painting was known in Kos, thus rendering the subject matter of the epigram identifiable from the start. While Leonidas does not explicitly identify Aphrodite's mother as the sea, likely assuming his readers will find some intellectual pleasure in distinguishing the mater as they decode the scene, Antipater, as he does with Tan Anaduomenon, makes the recognition of the scene and its characters explicit with thalassas. In line 3, Antipater uses dialect again to highlight his reading of the model by inserting Doric kaiton as a variation of Leonidas's komon. Turning to the final couplet, the judgment of Athena and Hera, Antipater inverts the distribution of dialect features. Leonidas wrote the name of Athena in Doric and used a dialectically unmarked periphrasis for Hera, and he described the deity's act of speech in a Doric future, the future form of Phemi. In their short declaration, the dialect coloring of the manuscripts are Koine, perhaps because Athena and Hera as gods would have been assumed not to speak Doric, the one feature notably absent from Epic. Conversely, Antipater employed the ionicized forms of Athena and Hera, reapplying a epicizing luster to their names, and replaced Leonidas's Doric future Phasusin with the Ionic Eriusin. In the speech of Athena and Hera, Antipater incorporates Doric morphos, which stands in contrast to the dialect used in the brief narrative that frames it. Like the imagined viewer of the painting, Athena and Hera are stunned by Apelles' masterpiece and its lifelike beauty. They concede in the beauty contest not to Aphrodite herself, but to Apelles' version. They admit, in other words, that they are no match for the morpha on display in Kos. If read from this perspective, Antipater's subtle application of Doric focalizes the deity's view of the painting, inviting the reader to imagine Athena and Hera standing in awe before the masterpiece. Next are two epigrams of Leonidas, 3a and 3b, on groups of female weavers who dedicate their implements to Athena. The two epigrams are transmitted together in the Greek anthology within a long Meleagrian sequence. Both are composed in a uniform Doric patina. For 3b, the choice of dialect is explained in part by the regional origins of the dedicators. Autonoma, Melitea, and Boiskion identify themselves as the daughters of Philolades and Nikes and hail from Crete, a Doric-speaking locale. The repetition of the Doric feminine nominative article at the head of lines 3 to 5 simply designates these three sisters, reinforcing their collective identity. The position of the two epigrams next to one another in a Meleagrian sequence suggests the anthologizer recognized their connection or excerpted the two in a similar position from a single authored collection of Leonidas's poetry. If this was the case, I propose that the shared dialect between the dedications of the Cretan sisters of 3b and the four sisters in 3a may have been designed to suggest that this dedication was also made by Cretans. In a similar fashion to Asclepiades' Ajax epitaph, Leonidas's weaver dedications employ dialect to recall epigraphic conventions, and so we find Antipater's imitation of these two epigrams borrowing the dialect features from his model as he varies their internal construction and the motivating purpose for the dedication. This is 3c. The Doric coloring is again limited to the substitution of alpha for eta. Antipater's first line is a summary of the components of the two Leonidas epigrams that allows him to quickly declare his dependence on the models. The Sidonian introduces variety into his imitation with the substitution of halykase for paides or thugateres, which lacks the specificity of the genetic relationship given in Leonidas. Similar to the use of Doric chiton in his imitation of the epigram on Apelles Anadyomene, Antipater colors halykase with the Doric vocalization, thus marking the variation with the dialect of the model epigram. Line 1 is also the most Doricized of the epigram, with three forms, tai, halykase, and arachna, which are evenly distributed throughout the hexameter in feet 2, 4, and 6. Antipater has Doricized terms that encapsulate the content of the model, three women, of some relation, making dedications related to weaving. The centrality of dialect to the reading and imitation of Leonidas's sister weaver dedications becomes even more apparent in Archias GP8, 3D, which combines features from both Leonidas and Antipater. On the whole, Archias, who echoes the diction and structural elements found in Leonidas and Antipater, follows the dialect of his models. Particularly notable is his adoption, with a slight variation in position, of the repeated use of the Doric feminine nominative article to reference the three sisters. Yet what is most striking about Archias's reading of the dialect practices of his two models has to do with the ethnic he uses for his sister weavers. Instead of borrowing the Cretan designation of Leonidas, Archias apparently innovates in making his dedicator Samian. Samians traditionally spoke a version of Ionic, and so a Doric-tinged dedication would not be in accord with linguistic reality. Archias's use of Samians has some important implications for how this late Hellenistic epigrammaticist read the function of dialect in his models. It is possible that Archias may not have interpreted the use of Doric in Leonidas as an evocation of epigraphic convention in the dedicator's Cretan identity. Perhaps by the 1st century BCE, the association between dialect and place was beginning to weaken, and that the dialect was used purely to reference his chain of models. The decline in dialect inscriptions Bubenik has found in most parts of the Doric-speaking Greek world, for example, support a general reduction of dialect use by this period. However, Meleager's use of Doric to signal the koan context of his self-epitaphs in a sequence of erotic epigrams likely on koan lovers, recently analyzed by Catherine Gutzwiller, is evidence for the continued association between dialect and place. A more likely scenario, in my opinion, is that Archias recognized the association between dialect and place in the Leonidean model. Note how the first couplet, whose content most closely recalls its models, contains dialectal features that make retrospective sense when we learn at the end of the pentameter of the sisters' Samian origins. To then immediately follow Samii with a Doric article, which again recalls the Leonidean model, would draw further attention to the dialect as a marker of the literary tradition in which Archias operates. On a broader level, the contrast between the identity of the sister weavers and dialect is possibly meant as a comment on the fictionality of book epigram, especially in a sequence of artistic imitations, in the reality of inscriptional practice. Until this point, I've examined Antipater's engagement with and reuse of the base dialect of his model epigram as part of his art of imitation. Using Asclepiades and Antipater's epigrams on Arena for my final example, I will demonstrate that dialectical deviation is an equally effective tool in Antipater's reading of a model. Recognized for her brief, cultivated, and generically innovative hexameters, Arena was admired among Hellenistic poets, particularly those who confessed a Kallimachean aesthetic. Part of this admiration manifested itself in epigrams celebrating her distaff. Asclepiades is the first Hellenistic book epigrammaticist known to have treated Arena. This is 4a. Asclepiades' epigram engages with the structure of epitaph, initially replacing the voice of the tomb or the deceased herself with the slim corpus of Arena's poetry. However, the identity of the speaker shifts following the bucolic diaeresis of line 3, from Arena's poetry to the poet herself. Arinna's origins were disputed in antiquity, with some believing she was a native of Lesbos, an idea likely influenced by the association of female poetry with the island, and others declaring her Talayan or Rhodian. The unique dialect composition of her distaff, a blend of Doric and Aeolic features, could be called upon to support either identification. Asclepiades' use of dialect simultaneously recalls epigraphic conventions of composing epitaphs in the native dialect of the deceased, and echoes the dialect coloring of Arinna's poetry, which facilitates the subtle shift in speaker. With the exception of Enea Kai Decateus in line 2, which should be read as Doric, the rest of the marked dialect features could be interpreted as either Doric or Aeolic, since both dialects share in the use of alpha for eta. Antipater's epigram on Arinna is 4b on your handout. The poem retains an epitaphic structure with the use of the deictic tuto in line 2 to refer to her distaff as a physically present object, which echoes Asclepiades' hutos ponos, and the address to imagined passerby, Zene, in line 6. However, here the speaker is not Arinna or her poetry, but one among those countless thousands of youthful poets, whose anonymity invites the reader to imagine is Antipater. Just as Leonidas Asclepiades shifts the identity of the speaker from poem to poet, so Antipater shifts the expectations of an epitaphic type voiced to that of a contemporary reader. Dialect is an active component in Antipater's play with voice here. The epigram is a base Hellenistic koine, with the presence of two Doric or Aeolic forms in the nominative of Arinna's name in line 1 and the genitive musos in line 2. If Arinna and musos were the only non-koine forms Antipater purposely incorporated into his epigram, they are perhaps meant to signal the initial epigraphic context of the poem that had its precedent in Asclepiades. It is common practice to use the dialect form of a deceased's name. The coloring of musos, a metonym for her poetry, points up the Doric Aeolic composition of her work, which was a source of scholarly interest. The second couplet opens with the prosaic toi gar toi that initiates the movement from commemoration to evaluation. Arinna's work has ensured her poetic immortality and favorable stylistic evaluation in comparison to modern poets. Just as the perspective and focus of the epigram shifts, so does the dialect from Doric or Aeolic to the lightly ionicizing color of the Hellenistic koine, the language of contemporary critical discourse. Moreover, should we choose to identify the voice of the speaker with Antipater, the dialect of the remainder of the epigram echoes the quality of the Greek spoken in the poet's Hellenized Sidon. The epigram enacts Antipater's process of reading that inspires his project of imitation, and the shift in dialect from the Doric Aeolic coloring of Asclepiades' epitaphic model to the Hellenistic koine of the poet's own voice inscribes this invisible mental process into the poem's linguistic fabric. In this paper, I've examined, through a series of test cases derived from the poetry of Antipater of Sidon and Archias, the place of dialect in the act of imitation and variation. 3rd century book epigrammaticists such as Asclepiades and Leonidas, whose dedications and epitaphs provided the raw material for the development of a poetics of imitation, employed dialect in order to enrich the poetic meaning of their works. Recognizing the literary quality of these authors' dialect practice from distant millennia, the question was, how did the readers and fellow epigrammaticists who studied and interpreted these epigrams understand and receive the dialect of their models? I have shown a pattern of dialectal engagement in the imitations of Antipater of Sidon and Archias. While not all imitators may have considered the dialect of their model, the case of Antipater and Archias suggests that later Hellenistic book epigrammaticists, in certain contexts, read their models with an eye to the productive meaning of its dialect. Accordingly, these examples of responses to dialect have the potential to expand our treatment of dialect usage in Hellenistic literary epigram to include dialect choice as an essential component of the reading, interpretation, and reuse of the epigrammatic tradition. As modern scholarship on Hellenistic epigram begins to reassess the function of dialect and develop a framework for reading epigrams for their dialect, we would be well suited to take poets like Antipater as our own model. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. Our next speaker is Lucia Floridi. She was a student of Marco Fantuzzi at Florence and took her PhD from Udine and is currently at University of Milan. She's been a very productive scholar in just a few years, with quite a number of articles to her name, most of them on imperial epigrams, particularly of the Scoptic kind. She has published two very comprehensive and important commentaries, one on Strato in 2007 and one on Lucilius just last year, 2014. So she will be speaking to us today on the topic of the language of Greek Scopic epigram of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine, for this presentation. Okay, in my paper today, I propose to describe the style and language of the most important representatives of Greek Coptic epigram. I will focus on the poets of the 1st, 2nd centuries AD, specifically on Lucilius, Nicarchus, and Ammianus. The reason why I choose this poet is that, unlike other preserved in Book 11 of the Greek Anthology, they can be dated with a certain degree of confidence, and their epigrammatic corpora are big enough to allow a comprehensive analysis of each poet's styles and diction. The aim of my survey is twofold. On the one hand, I intend to demonstrate that a better understanding of the style of these authors can sometimes lead to textual improvements in modern critical editions. Further, I wish to show that in spite of the differences among individual poets, we can detect several common traits of Scoptic epigram. These tendencies reveal a common interpretation of the subgenre and attest to change in the history of the literary epigram. Let us start with Lucilius, the father figure of Greek satirical epigram. In an important article published in 1968, Rudolf Keidel showed that the language of this epigrammatist is informal and non-classical. In particular, Lucilius' lexical, morphological, and syntactical choices are influenced by everyday language. The most distinctive feature of his style, in fact, is its colloquial character and its openness to the linguistic novelties of his time, as testified by papyri and post-classical texts, such as the New Testament, for instance. The analysis that I undertook while working on a new critical edition and commentary of Lucilius' epigrams allowed me to expand on Keidel's contribution. The most important features of Lucilius' colloquial style can thus be summarized as follows. We won't have the time to go through all the examples, but you find the relevant material on page 1 of your handout. From a lexical point of view, words can take a meaning they did not have in classical Greek. Lucilius employs some poetic and post-classical words. Also noteworthy is Lucilius' use of words borrowed directly from the language of comedy. Morphology. There are several morphological oddities. For instance, the superlative form melainotatas. From a syntactical point of view, normal intransitive verbs can become transitive. The perfect is used when an aorist form would be expected in classical Greek. The identification of these and other similar features can lead us to a better understanding of the text. A single example will suffice to clarify my point. It's text 1 in your handout. On line 1 of this epigram, scholars have detected a syntactic difficulty that has sparked various emendations. In particular, all the most recent editors print at the very beginning of the epigram as pelagos pleomen, Dübner's correction he, instead of the readings of the manuscripts. A of the Palatine manuscript is clearly corrupt, and Planudes' text has been accused of the same, since pleo in classical Greek is usually followed by the simple accusative or by n plus dative. According to Dübner, e will serve the purpose of emphasizing the word pelagos. This should be understood as a predicative of the subject aimed at anticipating the metamorphosis described in the epigram. I quote Dübner's word. Emei sontes pelagos pleomen, vere nos mare navigamus, nam mare sumus, non iam naute. Such an interpretation, however, is far-fetched to my mind, as the embarrassed translations of the editors clearly show. I thus kept Planudes' text For not only is ace plus accusatives in a local sense attested in Koine Greek, at least from the 2nd century BC onwards, when the distinction between motion and rest starts to become obscure, but it is also paralleled by Lucilius himself, and Lucilius also uses pros plus accusatives instead of para plus dative. Although Lucilius' predilection for informal linguistic feature is certainly the most remarkable trait of his poetry, this register does not prevent him from also using more refined poetic language. In targeting professional, his satire often appropriates different jargons. Indeed, one of the most typical Scoptic techniques is the reproduction of a given character linguistic mannerism. Medical jargon, for instance, when satire is directed against doctor. This technique is particularly effective when the targets of satire are poets, grammarians, and rhetoricians. Often, in this as in other cases, the author not only reproduces the language of his targets with their mannerism and sometimes actual mistakes, but he also creates new bombastic words that mimic their pretension language. In AP 11 140 is text 2 in your handout. The poet criticizes pedantic philologists who are only able to discuss Homeric questions, thus spoiling the joyful atmosphere of the banquet. At line 3, the author employs a colloquialism attested in Papyri and New Testament Greek, pain, a contract form for pain, which can be considered as the symbol of his heterodoxical expressive choices. In this very epigram, however, Lucilius also creates several neologisms. These are built on clever reworkings of rare Homeric words beset by debate amongst grammarians. See especially grammatolykryphisin at line 2 from lykryphis, a Homeric dyslegomenon, whose accent and etymology were debated. Neputie uomeno, to play childish games, from neputus, epic diminutive of nepios, much discussed by Homeric scholars. Elsewhere, the poet adopts Doric coloring in contexts that reproduce the atmosphere of athletic celebration, number 3 in your handout. In a similar vein, poetic and Ionic epic forms are used when a higher style is requested, for instance, text 4 in your handout. Expression and phrases reminiscent of epic language can occur, text 5, nor are actual poetic quotation, either literal or modified for humoristic purposes, missing. For instance, in text 2, at the end, you find the quotation of the beginning of the Iliad, Menina eidethea. Far from being a gratuitous parade of erudition, all these stylistic features play a specific role in Lucilius' poetry, where they serve to generate satire, often with intentional contrastive effects. Thus, although Lucilius privileges a plain and colloquial language, his style is, on the whole, rich and variegated and capable of adapting itself to the different needs of satire and of its targets. Nicarchus shares several linguistic features with Lucilius. His epigrams manifest a similar syntactic informality, such as preference for parataxis versus hypotaxis, interrogative clauses, proverbs, and so on. The poet also shares Lucilius' mimetic style, although he directs it towards fewer targets. We thus have epigrams on doctors, for instance. In a variation on the theme of the murderous doctor, Nicarchus also adopts the typical Lucilian form of the mock inscription, writing a mock epitaph, is AP 11 124, test 6 in your handout. Here, the parody of funeral inscriptions implies the adoption of a higher, more pretentious style, note, for instance, Doric man at line 1, or the poetic expression us gluceru fengus esterisen at line 3. And thus revealing the poet's ability to adapt his diction to different contexts. Another good example of such stylistic flexibility is Nicarchus 11:407, a variation on the typical Lucilian theme of the leptos, the abnormally thin man. You find the text number 7 in your handout. But especially interesting is text 8, 11:328. Here, Nicarchus plays entirely upon stylistic contrast by cleverly investing Homeric expressions with new obscene meanings in the description of a menage à quatre. While most of the stylistic features described so far show that Nicarchus can write very much like Lucilius, the Homeric parody of AP 11 300-8 is, for its very bawdiness, typically Nicarchian. It serves then as a good introduction to what is perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Nicarchus' poetry, his characteristic scurrilous vein, which distinguishes his epigram from those of other Scoptic poets. Prostitutes, patici, cunnilingus, and bizarre sexual intercourse are at home in Nicarchus' poetry. As a consequence, his language is often sexually loaded, either through the use of primary obscenities or through the use of metaphor or lexical ambiguity. These terms might derive from the imagery and language of previous poetry, especially comedy, but others are unique to Nicarchus and presumably inspired by contemporary linguistic uses. Apart from several common sexual euphemisms, Nicarchus' poems show a particular predilection for crude words and sexual metaphors. Among the most remarkable are the one you find in your handout, the mild obscenity deo, the coarser proctos, derived from comedies, also collops, which maybe means prostitute, coirus, literary young pig, porker, a common slang term for the pudenda muliebra. Let's have a closer look at 11-329, text 9 in your handout. In this epigram, Nicarchus described the hairy dangers met by the cunnilingus. At line 2, the nenkoros akantaneke, the metaphor is quite clear. Akanta hints at pubic hair. And the implied reference in Nicarchus to the rose hints at the pudenda muliebra, as often in comedy. At line 3, the description of the drawbacks of the monarch's activity proceeds through another sexual metaphor, emphoinike decateudes, which clearly alludes to the acts of phoinikids to imitate the Phoenicians, that is, to act as a cunnilingus, to mouth the vaginal orifice. One should note that Nicarchus does not employ the actual verb, but alludes to the sexual habit attributed to the Phoenicians through a geographical metaphor, and phoinike decateudes, where the act of sleeping is also obviously significant in the erotic context. A sexual metaphor is finally implied in the last line. Here, in a mock mythological context, the cunnilingus is described as merotraphes, an epithet for Dionysus, which playfully alludes to the passion of the monarchs for meroi, or better, for what is between them, mesos meron. A similar longing for linguistic novelty is demonstrated by 11.7, an epigram on the inevitability given human nature of conjugal infidelity. The poem combines the use of a common euphemism for sexual intercourse, such as kinein, line 2, with original neologism, philoknisos, created on the basis of a common erotic euphemism, knizo, widely used metaphorically of love, allotriokros, which entails a novel combination of two common words, allotrios and cross. Xenocus tapaten, at the very end of the poem, combines with comic contrastic effects the vulgar custos, a comic slang for pudenda muliebra, with the adjectives xenapates, attested in lyric poetry and in tragedy. Given the context, one might also wonder whether phusis, line 3, is to be taken as a euphemism for peos. Phusis, as natura in Latin, is commonly used in Greek in this sense. The poet will thus be witty hinting at the fact that it is the man's membrum to always long for new erotic adventures, in keeping with the search for custos declared in the epigram's closure. We don't have the time to look at the next example. A certain fondness for linguistic novelty on the part of Nicarchus is also testified in non-erotic context. Noteworthy among these neologisms are, for instance, the compounds lepte pi leptoteros, tin upon tin, and other examples are in your handout. It's relevant that there are several colloquialisms, and again, we won't go through all of them, but you find them in your handout. Nicarchus' tendency to incorporate linguistic materials from everyday language is also testified by a number of Latinisms, the Roman measure sestes from Latin sextarius, miliarium from Latin miliarium, and so on. All these words significantly denote common object and belong to everyday speech. So, on the whole, Nicarchus' style can be defined as informal and colloquial, open to linguistic novelties and everyday language, and prone to coarseness and obscenity. It is, however, at the same time rich, inventive, variegated, capable of combining different features and registers, learned and literary in its own way. The main differences with respect to Lucilius are its scurrility, its frequency of sexual words and metaphor, and the greater lexical receptiveness toward Latin. Let's quickly talk about Ammianus. Ammianus is a poet with a taste for puns, and several epigrams entail word puns with personal names. The first example is text 13 in your handout, 11231. Here the poet exploits the technique of scommata paragramma and diagramma, theorized, for instance, by Aristotle. The addressee is a beast, but for one letter, and the man because of a letter. The missing information to solve the riddle is provided by the preceding epigram, where the name of the man is specified. Marcos, without the letter, is a beast, that is, Arcos. Arcos is a colloquial word, the later form for Arctos, only attested in imperial prose, New Testament Greek, and non-literary works. In a similar vein, in 1181, Polemon's name, it is recognized, is Antonio, but 3 letters are suddenly missing, that is Onios, venal. 11180 is another attack on Polemon. Some kind of play on the 2 temporal expression eidois and nonais in line 1 is implied in the poem, as has long been recognized, while the first almost certainly aims at suggesting something like eidos or eidoies, if you give him something, that is, if you bribe him. Nonais must hint at the opposite, kammedos. On the basis of 11181, where Polemon is accused of venality, an equivalence nonais anones has been suggested. Other scholars prefer to think that nonais might play on Latin non-eyes, if you say no, or non-eyes, no cash. A bilingual pun on the Latin negative non is in fact a likely possibility, especially given the fact that eidois and nonais are Greek transpositions of Latin temporal expressions. These are rarely found in Greek prose and almost exclusively in authors treating Roman mothers, such as Plutarch, for instance, or in technical contexts, such as epigraphic documents. One should also note that the puns on personal names analyzed so far suggest as well, at least to a certain extent, a bilingual context in which the audience was presumed to be able to connect Roman names such as Marcus or Antonius with Greek words. Other puns in Ammianus' epigram reveal the author's rhetorical training. 11188 plays on the widely discussed etymology of Apollo as destroyer from Apollume. 1116 entails a false etymology for the Homeric adjective enkesimoroi. Ancient grammarians were puzzled by the second element of this word, usually explaining it as oi perita enke memoremenoi, opere stipe ponemenoi, vel similia. Ammianus connects the word to moros, dull, stupid, as the closure of the epigram makes clear. Other poems use myth to exemplify everyday situations. For instance, 1114, where the myth of the Gorgon is used to describe an everyday reality. It is noteworthy that mythical examples do not imply the adoption of a more elevated diction. On the contrary, the language of these poems is plain. AP 1114 particularly exhibits one of the more colloquial terms found in Ammianus' epigram, thyle, for cushion. The word, attesting comedy, is condemned, for instance, by Phrynikos as a non-Attic form, thylen eikai euris pu suc nephalon lege. Given such a clearly rhetorical personality, it comes as no surprise that amongst Ammianus' favorite victims are men of letter and science, such as bad rhetoricians and philosophers. When satirizing these targets, the poet sometimes adopts a mimetic style. You find a couple of examples, text 20 and 21 in your handout, where, as in several Lucilius epigrams, the adoption of the rhetorician language entails the reproduction of his very errors. or the affectation of the philosopher of Ammiano's days are ridicule in text 21. So the most distinguished features of Ammiano's epigram are taste for puns and the flair for bilingualism. Although we do not know much about the author's biography, his rhetorical training is evident in the ways he plays with language. Elevation of diction is rare. At the same time, Ammiano's style is never too informal. From a lexical point of view, the number of actual colloquialism is very limited. Ammiano's style is thus characterized by a certain medietas. It is never too high, nor is it ever too colloquial or coarse. I'm going to conclude. 3 different poetic personalities have emerged from this survey. Lusaglio's style is casual, strongly influenced by common speech, both on a lexical and on a syntactical level. But it is also capable of elevation in diction through the creation of neologisms, the adoption of poetic forms, and actual poetic quotations. Nicarchus is especially characterized by his propensity toward obscenity, combined with a taste for mixing the low and the high via a marked linguistic creativity. His lexicon often reflects everyday speech and testifies to a world characterized by a certain degree of bilingualism. Some of the words found in his epigram are only paralleled by papyri and graffiti. Ammiano, finally, has a special taste for pun, which also entail a certain degree of bilingualism. He is, in general, less colloquial than both Lusaglius and Nicarchus, and at the same time less prone to stylistic elevation and lexical creativity. His epigram appeal to the literate by virtue of their sophisticated play with language, an indication of the author's own rhetorical and literary training. Therefore, it would be wrong to treat these poets as a stylistic wool. Nevertheless, they certainly share the tendency to incorporate contemporary linguistic material into their poems and to mimic linguistic characteristics of their targets while simultaneously engaging with the literary tradition, each in their own way. The stylistic choices of the 3 poets thus testify to a common interpretation of Coptic epigram in a time when this subgenre was becoming prominent. The expansion of the Coptic form in the Neronian age opens a new avenue for the practitioners of the genre. Epigram admits new themes and becomes the genre par excellence of satire and abuse. During this period, epigrammatists tend to portray and satirize their everyday reality with all of its excesses and its ridiculousness. This implies an aesthetic change with respect to the stylistic trends shown by the authors of the Garland of Philip vis-à-vis the tendency of early authors included in Meleger's Garland. Although these 2 sets of poets vary significantly in diction and style, the following generalization should give us a general picture of the most relevant stylistic trends recognizable in the 2 generations of epigrammatists. The authors of the first Garland are, for the most part, learned poets prone to experimentalism, especially in voice and narrative technique, at a time when epigram was starting to free itself from the object it was inscribed upon and to acquire a purely literary status. These authors are highly conscious of their role in the development of the genre and pay close attention to their relationship with previous poetry. The language of authors such as Callimachus, Asclepiades, and Poseidippus varies greatly with individual words and expression deriving from many different literary genres and registers. And although these poets often disguise such complexity to convey an impression of stylistic clarity, their language is on the whole elaborate and complex. Words and characteristics of high poetry may occur, and some of these may reflect the spoken language, especially in poems indebted to genres closest to ordinary speech, such as comedy and mime. However, the number of actual colloquialisms as regards both syntax and lexicon is relatively small and works within the general Hellenistic tendency to combine the high and the low in sophisticated manner. The poets of the second Garland, for their part, are often skillful versifiers who write variations on commonplace topics in an affected and recherché style. They are prone to lexical complexity and exert their creativity mostly through unexpected neologisms and the use of poetic imagery and tropes. Redundant epithets, rare words, long sequences of almost equivalent ideas are the hallmark of their style, often rightly labeled as Baroque. With Lusaglius, Nicarchus, and Ammianus, yet another change occurs. New subjects, strongly connected to a critical observation of everyday reality, enter the realm of epigram. To describe such an ordinary reality, the poets renounce the mannerisms that were in fashion in the age of the second Garland and opt for a more straightforward style. Syntax and lexicon echo the ordinary language of the human categories described, and the mimesis of their expressive habits is often felt as the best way to capture their peculiarities and faults. In addition, these Coptic authors do not draw only from formalized literature when writing their poems, but also take into account the popular forms of narratives such as jokes, punchline, and funny stories, which exercise an influence over style and structure. I did not have the time to examine this aspect, but it is very important. On the other hand, satirical exaggeration often leads to the search for stylistic effectiveness, hence the creation of neologisms with expressive contrast, the recuperation of literary words and images, and the often abrupt elevation of diction. Coptic epigram mimic the ordinary while commenting on it. To do so, it often has recourse to the tools of language and literature. This leads to effects of linguistic diversity so far unparalleled in the history of the genre. Greek Coptic poets write in a colloquial informal style, borrowing words and syntactical structure from ordinary language and combining them with lexical inventiveness, poetic reminiscences, and occasional engagement with grand style, always with marked effect of contrast. After the disguised learned complexity of Meleager poets and the strong formalization of Philip Garland, such linguistic freedom and mimesis of ordinary speech mixed with lexical novelty and traditional poetic language must have been felt as an important change in the aesthetics of epigram, a long-lasting and continually shifting literary genre. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lucia, for that very rich paper. So we have just a few minutes left for some questions for either of our presenters. Andre.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much. I have actually a comment for Taylor, and I enjoyed your paper very much. I'm just wondering whether the category of Homeric, which you use, might be refined in some way, because you simultaneously used Homeric and Aeolic in your paper, and some of the forms, for instance, this Theochesin, have traditionally been associated with lesbian dialect or Aeolic dialect or dialectologists such as Ridiger Schmidt, for instance, classify Ames and these forms. Maybe Homeric is sort of blurring the clear picture that you have presented.
Yeah, I agree that that's sort of it's a difficult. It can be difficult at times to put every form into one box. So when sort of marking these poems up, I decided to avoid marking things as Aeolic necessarily, just because there are very few forms that are sort of definitely characterized as Aeolic, and there are other forms that are not technically Ionic, but people often categorize as epic Ionic, and I try to stay away from that classification. So for this paper, there were certain forms I wanted to note sort of the contrast with the Doric primarily, by pointing out that they were primarily associated with sort of epic language without calling them epic Ionic, knowing I'm using sort of a fuzzy term with Homeric because of the layers of language in a Homeric context. So that's something I'm kind of dealing with as I write about this, how to put words into context without leaning one way too far or the other. So and here, to make the text a little bit clearer, I just kind of marked things as Homeric, so we didn't have another category of italicized and underlined and bolded text. But thank you.
Other questions? Comments? It's your chance here. Oh, yes, so Gregory.
Could I cheat and ask a quick question of both our speakers? I wondered, Taylor, if you could tell us more about Doric iambi. Seems an interesting combination. And Lucia, thank you very much for all that very interesting information on lots of different categories. I was reminded when you were talking about some of these inventive compounds of a bit in Plutarch's Symposiastic Questions, Book 8, where there's a sort of spontaneous creation of compounds between Plutarch's sons who are late for a party and somebody else's sons. It seems to be a sort of instantaneous game. I wondered if this sort of gave us a larger cultural context for this sort of inventiveness.
Taylor first.
So you're asking about the Leonidas epigram on Apelles. That's a great question. I haven't had the chance. It's one of the things I want to look at, and I haven't had a chance to do a full analysis, is dialect in the sort of non-elegiac group of Hellenistic epigrams to see if there's some sort of relationship between meter and dialect choice. In terms of this epigram, I don't have a great explanation of why Doric here in relation to the meter. If someone has a thought, I'd love to hear it. I've sort of been focusing on the relationship between the context of the work of art and the dialect related to that. But anything else to enrich the readings of these poems in terms of their dialect would be welcome. Thanks.
Something that just occurred to me was the acmes angelos, which might make us think of tragedy and an Attic form.
I was actually thinking about that word, acmes. It's also an artistic technical term applied to Apelles' work. We have it as one of the terms used to describe his skill. So I think I read that form in there, acmes, instead of what people often want to correct that to acmas, is a pointed look at sort of terminus technicus there. And he switches dialect when referring to that term. But I can continue to look into the possible meanings.
Yeah, and angelos as well is interesting.
Thank you, Gregory, for this observation. Yes, the question is much debated whether Scoptic epigram was actually was born at a symposium, whether it was a more formalized kind of poetry. But I think in this case, improvisation can have a role. Thank you for the reference to Plutarch. I'll have a look at it. Yeah, poets sometimes seems to enjoy to do a competition, the one with the other. Not only they want to win the other, not only in creating always new images, more surrealistic and so on, but also in language. So yes, there is certainly this aspect. Thank you very much.
Perhaps one more question or comment before we break. Are people hungry? No, we have one.
It's not hungry.
A quick one.
For Mr. Coughlin, I was wondering about at handout 4A, about Asclepiades, verse 2. Is there a metrical trick with Enea and Decatefs? Because I'm thinking that Asclepiades here using the second part of the elegiac pentameter for emphasis to Runa's death age. Okay, more dramatic for her, more sematura. It could be more dramatic, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's an interesting point. I need to look more at sort of as following up to the previous question on a relationship between meter and dialect choice. And here I think you've noted something that I'll take note of.
It's expanding that much, yeah. So there is an indication there. Thank you.
Well, on that note, let's thank our speakers again and take our break.